monastic community in Brewster, New York, on an organic farm. And my spiritual journey has sort of woven its way along through the Christian tradition in an interesting way. I began in the Pentecostal church, so much more charismatic and more fundamentalist expression of Christianity, and had struggled with that early in my journey, probably in high school. And then my parents left the church that I'd grown up in, and at first I was very relieved just to be outside of the church. But very quickly I realized that I was missing spiritual community. And so I started visiting different churches. I would borrow my parents' car and head off on my own on Sunday, and eventually wandered into an Episcopal church. At the same time, late in high school, I'd had a bit of an eastward turn, and so I was reading texts like the Upanishads and the Tao Te Ching, and that was opening up the whole mystical, contemplative dimension of faith. And then when I made my way into the Episcopal Church, I found the Catholic side of Christianity where all those cool, radical mystics were hanging out, like Meister Eckhart and Julian of Norwich, and I started finding what I was being fed by in those Eastern traditions had a home in Christianity, that as a Protestant we had skipped over, from Jesus to Martin Luther. And so in college I began discernment towards the priesthood, and began a journey into seminary a couple years out of college. And at the same time, I was looking for mentoring in my spiritual journey, looking for mentors who could really guide me on a deep contemplative and transformational path. And I was really having trouble finding that wisdom in the Christian church. I was finding it in texts, but I wasn't finding it in living teachers and communities. And so I began turning to sources like Islamic Sufism, like Vedanta within Hindu tradition, to find teachers who really had an understanding of what that spiritual journey was about. And so I finished seminary, I was ordained to the priesthood, and I moved to the community I live with now, and I began holding a post as a Christian priest, but my identity has become deeply interspiritual at the same time, and permeable to these other traditions and wisdoms, while I sort of anchor myself, or the post that I hold, in the Christian sacred world. So that's kind of where I am now.
I'm Porter Taylor. I'm the 6th bishop of the Diocese of Western North Carolina, so that's more or less I-77 West. I am what we call a lifelong Episcopalian. My mother was an Episcopalian, my grandmother was an Episcopalian, and my father became an Episcopalian when he married my mother. I sort of left the Episcopal Church when I went to college, went to Chapel Hill. I grew up in Asheville, and found my way back into the church really through poetry and Thomas Merton. I ended up going to graduate school and took half my classes at the Candler School of Theology at Emory and half in the English department, and wrote my dissertation on mysticism in the poetry of Theodore Roethke. I always knew I wanted to be a priest, but I just didn't know if I wanted to be part of the church. So for a long time I taught high school English, then college English, and finally had a sort of midlife event when I realized I was actually mortal, and went on and pursued the priesthood. Became a priest and served in a church in Nashville, Tennessee, and then in Athens, Georgia, until I was elected Bishop of West North Carolina. My passion when I was in Athens was to help start a spirituality program at the parish. And as bishop, I oversee 65 parishes, and we've been very involved in the Episcopal Church in terms of reorganization. But my passion has been a fear that we're going to move the chairs around the deck and forget our deep connection. So I believe that the movement that I've been trying to be part of in the Episcopal Church is to remember our roots and to remember how we're connected to God in here.
Well, my name is Cynthia Bourgeau. I'm following the pecking order. I too am an Episcopal priest. Been so since 1979. I wasn't raised in the Episcopal Church. I was actually raised in Pennsylvania. My mother was a Christian Scientist. I was sent to Quaker schools. So my early immersion through the Quakers was a deep and wonderful immersion in silence. The Quakers just threw you right into the deep pool of silence, didn't teach you anything about how to do it, because they figured it was a natural human instinct you'd know. And I did somehow. I remember these great old times sitting in the big old vaulting 18th century meeting house, just feeling the beauty and silence and mystery of the whole thing. So as I grew up, I went searching, went to high school, fell in love with religion. We had compulsory religion and religious studies in our high school, and I was hooked. I loved the whole 9 yards. And in college, I went searching for a department of religion. They didn't have one. And I knew I didn't want philosophy. So like you, Porter, I wound up doing English literature, and then French literature, and then music. And it was the interest in arts that got me fascinated with medieval studies, and then the medieval Christian church. I came in through the root of its beautiful music, its mystery dramas, its arts. And in the midst of inventorying and loving its art, I had a totally out of left field Eucharistic conversion. I went to what I thought was a Sunday morning concert by a boy choir, wound up in a communion line, was too scared to bail out, and so wound up taking communion for the first time. And the rest was history. I realized that something lived in this tradition, that it was a living lineage, went through a deep kind of anguishing conversion experience as my head said, no, this can't be, this is stupid, this doesn't make sense. And I just kept marching up to our parish church at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was doing grad school in medieval studies, and sharing communion and getting involved in liturgy. And before long, I found myself in seminary, and then very often, very quickly after that, ordained as an Episcopal priest in an Episcopal church which at that point was just opening the gates to women. I wasn't certainly in the first barricade, but I came in 3 years after it had been officially sanctioned. So I was in, and I took my stint in parish ministry, but I felt almost from the start this kind of deep worry about what I felt to be a cognitive dissonance I just couldn't understand. Why was it that a religion whose epicenter is in a teacher who the world agrees is one of the eminent teachers of love and light and inclusion and human compassion, why did the church always seem to express itself in forms and formats that were rigid and judgmental and exclusionary? And I felt like something must have gone missing in the message, and I went searching for it. And like Matthew, I began to find the way in through the great contemplative traditions of the West, the great mystics, but I discovered them practicing in monasteries. And I very soon got hooked into the great Benedictine monasteries, mostly Roman Catholic of nature, discovered the Benedictines in Collegeville, Minnesota. Quickly afterwards, and through them, discovered the Trappists of Thomas Merton fame, and then Thomas Keating fame. I went to a little monastery in Snowmass, Colorado in the early 1990s to study centering prayer, sensing that this form of Christian meditation practice could reconnect my Quaker roots and also might provide the missing piece to sort of move back through that disconnect zone and help us find a way to put traction in this imperative to universal love. So I found it, and I also found teachers and teachings that helped to see that the missing piece lay in something that I quickly identified as wisdom. I took some teaching. I spent some times in esoteric schools. Like Matthew, I spent a little bit of time working with the Sufis. And I became convinced that there were actually paths and practices that taught people and formed people in the habits of being that were required to thread the gap and move from a sort of egocentric and judgmental life to a universal and inclusive and altruistic one. So I began, not really intending to do so, to form and offer teaching called wisdom schools. It grew out of leading contemplative retreats where we set people down on meditation cushions and had them do centering prayer all day. But we moved from there into adding in what was the witnessing dimension, mindfulness practice, physical embodiment, sacred chanting. And it caught, and it took off, and everybody wants to go to wisdom school because it's fun, it's experiential, it's integral, it combines a deep life of faith and devotional practice and contemplative practice with some hands-on work that shift gear. So at this point, 66 years old, officially retired, I find myself sort of midwifing this kind of parallel Christian network of lineage and transmission and formation that I do really feeling in deep partnership with the institutional church, but also consciously holding a space for people I call heartbroken Christians who for various reasons have found that they just couldn't find a way to be in the institutional church, but didn't want to throw Jesus out, the baby out with the bathwater, and want to find a Christian home. So I feel like I'm kind of involved, more feeling my way than knowing what I'm doing, in developing this wisdom network.
I'm Mahan Seiler. I'm a retired Baptist minister, 78, who lives in Asheville, North Carolina. I grew up Southern Baptist and was scripted to go into the family business. Everybody assumed I would. I'm the only son, and I assumed it till I started flunking economics at university and other signs that maybe I was on the wrong path. And in university, it wasn't in a church setting. It was in a campus setting where I got the sense of a larger purpose that, hey, I could be about more than selling pork and beans, and that the way I awakened to faith was the sense of, wow, I could be a part of something grand and large, and so that set in me a deep curiosity. And when I finished Vanderbilt University, a friend and I bummed around Europe and cycling and so forth, hitchhiking. And I knew I could take only one book. And I asked my favorite professor, what's one book you would recommend to me? And he must have known me better than I knew myself. He said, take Evelyn Underhill's classic book on mysticism. So I just devoured and lived with that book all that summer. And it put me in touch with this, the mystery of which I was a part. It just awakened me to levels of wonder and mystery. And so I go to the seminary to say, well, maybe I have so much interest in this faith, and go to the seminary and maybe get paid for pursuing this. And so I go to the seminary and do my first paper on the mysticism of St. Francis. And the feedback I got was, we just don't do mysticism here at this Baptist seminary. So that part of me sort of went underground, although I did go to Gethsemane, Trappist Monastery, and Gethsemane, Bardstown occasionally. So there was still a hunger there. In a course in pastoral cares, the teacher was unpacking a typical kind of pastoral care incident. And I remember saying, I want to do that. So I got this clear call to be a pastor that still is so much of who I am. So at the seminary, there was a young young teacher, Glenn Henson, who understood Vatican II. Nobody else in the seminary did, but understood that some doors were opening. And he took advantage of that and got to know Thomas Merton. They became good friends. It was just 30 miles away. And so I tagged along with Glenn often to be with Merton. When I got in graduate school, I did a paper on Merton, asking if I could come and read the paper and have him respond. And he did. So that I knew I was going home when I was trying to understand. I couldn't understand a lot, but the contemplative hunger just got fed, even in a new way. So then I go into the pastorate, and it was a busy time in D.C. between 67 and 72. And I just turned the spigot on, and this water ran out. I just ran out of gas, burned out's the phrase. I limped away in retreat, wondering about the vocation. And so I didn't go back in the pastorate. I went to a place of teaching for a while, pastoral care in a hospital setting. But that drive, that yearning to be a pastor, try it again, came. So there was quite a maverick Baptist church in Raleigh. I went there as pastor. And was there for 15 years. And during a controversy, we became very open to LGBT persons, and it booted us out of the Baptist convention. But in that crisis, when I thought this church was splitting down the middle, I just didn't have I didn't have the depth of prayer. I just didn't have the roots, and I was just being bounced around, reacting to all this anxiety. An old Sunday school teacher read about this in the Nashville, Tennessee paper, sent me Keating's book, Open Heart, Open Mind, saying, something in me says this might be helpful. And I hadn't seen him in 30 years. And so I started centering prayer, and that took me to another level. Went out to Snowmass to be in that training program for a number of times. So that became a serious practice. It kind of helped me go more deeply in that contemplative stream. It anchored me for the rest of my pastoral ministry. And then when I retired, I wanted and have worked with clergy of all stripes. In fact, not Baptist much anymore, but other types. And particularly interested, is there a way they can both experience the rootedness in this contemplative life, that it's not about them and it's not up to them, and do that in community with peers. So all these years, 12, 14, I've been working with clergy and clergy communities, both around working on their inner life, being open to the heart, not just the head, and do that in community. And so that's what I've been doing. I went to one conference and back 9 years ago, saw the book, Cynthia's book on centering prayer, picked it up, didn't know her. That book took that practice to another level, and I've been a student of hers ever since. So all of that, I'm still feeling my way about how this stream can be accessible to those who are in more conventional roles in the church as priests or pastors. And I'm also interested in the impact of all of this movement for eldering in our culture.
I didn't know your story, and just listening to moving from Matthew's journey as a much younger priest and seeker, and all the ways that you were supported, and at all those junctures you were handed these treasures that guided, and but you had an open and receptive heart and longing for that, and I've heard you talk about now at this phase in your life and in your vocation, how as an elder can these wisdom practices and traditions feed leadership within the church and really beyond. But would you like to start with talking about the lineage and...
Well, just in other words, one of the things two things have been pivotal to me in the last few years. One is the awareness that for the first time in human history, you can get to be 65 and reasonably speculate, I could have 2 or 3 more decades. Right. And to know that there are others like myself who are privileged to have to have time, to have relationships, to have some sense of financial security, to have hopefully some perspective, who want to steward this time in our life in ways that do impact the movement of God in the world. And that just strikes me as amazing, that there are others like myself who, in our culture, who are not content to say, well, I'm going to retire and go play, or I'm going to retire and just be put out to pasture. There's enormous power here. And the second event that has ignited a lot of this passion is I was a part of a walk for grandchildren this summer. Somebody in Asheville had the idea when he was 70, what did he want for his birthday? And he said, I want to do some act that has impact for my grandchildren and so forth. And he was very active in concerns around global warming. So there's this walk we did from Camp David to D.C. called Walk for Grandchildren, and had a rally and a protest against the Keystone XL pipeline. But when I first heard about that, I said, yes, I care about these grandchildren and their children. And I asked my grandchild, I said, I'll do it if you do it. So here we did this walk, my grandchild who's 12, and my son, Mark, and myself. But I just felt this enormous power available for these kind of current concerns if we can somehow tap into them. And so I don't know what eldering means, but I think it's a new force that's coming, particularly in our culture, if we can work with it.
Well, you know, what you're saying really, really resonates to me, man. And as I listen to the stories, Matthew's story particularly, it's twigging an event that took place in my life just a couple of weeks ago. I was teaching at a conference out in the Midwest, a lot of professional people in psychotherapeutic. And somebody asked me a question about, she says, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious. And they asked me on a panel, well, are you spiritual but not religious? And I asked them, what do you mean by that? And they had defined religious as belonging to an institutional church, and spiritual meant not. And I found myself saying, it was the first time I've ever articulated it, I said, no, you can't be spiritual without being religious. because there's an old statement from Meister Eckhart. He says, "No being without a mode of being." Right. In other words, water's got to flow through some channel if it's going to go. And that through the religions come really, ideally, lineages of transmission. And it's not the doctrine, it's the roots, it's the wisdom, it's the eldering. And I'm struck in your story that just a little bit of it, you read Thomas Merton, you meet Thomas Merton, you meet Glenn Henson, that there's people who have a little bit more stature, who themselves have responded to some quality of being, they pass it on to you. Mm-hmm. And that Matthew, when you went to your explorations with Vedanta and Sufism, there was the sense of a real teacher there and a living transmission lineage. And certainly in my own life, that's what I was looking for in Christianity. That somehow it had gotten completely identified with external power, that the transmission came through the bishops, no offense, Porter, but through the duly appointed authoritarian structures, and sometimes it was like pouring from empty to empty, in terms of somebody that really knew, that had this quality of being. And I believe that it's that wisdom, that transmission, that's passed on, and that the elder, that the Abba, or the Amma, as it used to be called in the desert tradition, is the living figure that constellates and calls forth the living next generation. And my own desperation in the church would be, how do we move it? That when we have transmission and lineage and roots so bound up with external structures, how do we touch this deeper water and grow up living elders that will then be passing the tradition on to those that are just below them in the pipeline?
That certainly resonates with my own experience. I think when I first started discovering the contemplative and mystical current within Christianity, I thought, wow, this is something that doesn't have enough voice within the church, because I had gone many years without hearing a word of it. And I thought, this is something I want to work to creatively renew in the life of the church. But then very quickly I began to realize, before I can work to renew it, I have to be mentored in it. And so then I began looking for elders who were holding the wisdom as a living tradition. And I found that, they weren't accessible in our tradition. And that other traditions held their metaphysics, their contemplative spirituality, their mysticism, they wore it on their sleeves. And Christianity had it sort of tucked away, and that the path, the sense of transmission, had largely been broken. And then after my journey into seminary, I think I began to understand even more so why seminary training is essentially a 3-year professional degree. And it's not a deep and rigorous formation in prayer and spiritual practice and contemplative training. It's not about forming people of prayer or transforming consciousness or creating elders. It's about giving people it's about pouring information about church history, church doctrine into people's heads, giving them a bit of practical skill and pushing them out into the world. And so I'm really interested in what you, Mahan, are talking about in eldering and really creating structures to form elders and mentors. Right. And to transmit this kind of Christian wisdom stream that is being renewed in the world today. And I wonder how that can be integrated into our seminaries so that people are really learning to embody it there, because the seminaries are so formed in the sort of Western academic and rational-minded approach to knowledge. Right. It's not knowledge that's experiential and grounded in the heart. It's largely in the head center. So.
I'm going to try to be optimistic first. So, but I want to say a couple of things. The first thing I'll say is that I've been bishop for 9 years, and I have finally acquiesced to acknowledge the authority of bureaucracy. So my take on this is that we try to push the structures, but our salvation is finally not in that place. I mean, so we should try to push seminaries, but if we wait for the seminary curriculum to change in order to form new priests, we're going to be in trouble. So we should try to do that. But the other thing is that the good news that I witness is that there is such a hunger. There's just such a hunger for people to feel connected to something bigger than themselves. And there's such a hunger for people to have a sense they're part of something that makes a difference. So, my daughter is 25 years old, and when I talk to her friends where they go to church, they say, we don't go to church. When I ask them why, they say, because it's not about anything. And what they want it to be about is something that's connected here and something that's connected out there. Yeah. And I believe that our opportunity is to finally feed that hunger wherever it comes from. And I believe, it's really the contemplative. We can start either way. But in my experience, it's worked. The outward movement feeds automatically into the contemplative movement.
This calls to mind a story from seminary when I was visiting some other communities, other spiritual communities, to try to meet the hunger that I was feeling that wasn't being fed in seminary chapel and in the classroom. And so one night I went and visited a small Sufi circle that met in a home. And we had a meal together, and we chanted together, and we prayed together, and it felt like something real had happened. And the next morning, I decided to get up and visit a large parish in D.C., which I'll leave unnamed, and the contrast was overwhelming. I was in this big church with rigid pews, with people sitting in their suits and ties and all their best clothes, and the priest essentially up on the stage talking about pledge cards and how to heat the building for the winter, and all these wonderful practical things. But it felt so different from that intimacy in a home with prayer and a meal. And I thought, this must be what the early church was like. This is the experience I had the night before. And so I wonder how we can start crafting those communities that can carry that energy within Christianity. And I wonder if the large church structure, if it's not what can serve that anymore. I know when I visited those other communities, be it a Zen circle or a Sufi circle, they tended to be smaller and they tended to be focused on the deep spiritual journey. And people came to those communities for that very purpose and function. And perhaps for that reason they were smaller, but very intentional. Whereas in the parish context, people come to church for a whole variety of reasons, be it just conventional religious observance or social reasons. And within that larger context, you may find a handful of people who want to gather for the Wednesday night centering prayer group, but the community itself isn't cultivating that. And so it's a real difference between the parish model and then the small circle focused on the journey. So I wonder how we carry that.
I think that's what Cynthia, I think that's what you're doing, is that you are letting go of so much of the outer trappings and getting to the core, so that it's about an experience, it's about discovering in this new way this radical good news that God is alive, closer to you than your own breath.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that one of the models that I was exposed to at one point during the search was the whole idea of exoteric, mesoteric, and esoteric as three levels, on the same journey. Ken Wilber has come back to this in recent years and baptized it much more gently, the conveyor belt. But that the exoteric church, the church with the doors and that people come in off the streets, the church that needs pastors, the church that's there when you're ready to put a bullet in your head in the middle of the night, that church serves an extraordinarily important function, and that without access to it, people aren't ready to go further.
Right.
You know, its
Right.
its role is to create a basic welcome container, basic pastoral ethical nurturance, and a sense of devotional reference points. From there on, then it opens into mesoteric, which is about path, which is about practice. And that's where you really, really sort of bring in the centering prayer, the chanting, the psalmody, the orders of life. And that then drives and makes possible the gateway into the esoteric, which is badly misunderstood in our culture. That it's a sort of equated with the secret knowledge, these cosmic pin codes, where it really means just the deeper understanding and the deeper immersion in what was there all along in the exoteric, but you didn't get it before. So the mesoteric is the real bridge. And I think it's that bridge that people are hungering for. That's the place that we try and give them in wisdom school. And certainly that's the bridge I crossed without ever looking back when I became a teacher of centering prayer. That up to that point, I'd already had some ideas about Christian practice. The monasticism was in my head, but I didn't have any way to get traction with it. And when I became a credentialed, commissioned presenter, I could say, okay, folks, we're going to do centering prayer. We're here to learn to do it. We're here to do it. And then you trust the rest to centering prayer, because it begins to change the way people think. And as it increases, and there's brain science now to show that meditative practice increases our capacity to bear paradox, to live in ambiguity, and to not immediately react from reactive defensive postures. And it's the part that was missing in the church. Nobody knew how to do this. Nobody made time, and they were drowning in their own sort of surfaceness. So I realized that just for my own salvation, the only place I could be useful in Christianity was to carve myself out an oasis where I was working with people that wanted to step into the mesoteric. And that's where I've been working since. But I think that it's not a either or. That I know there's a lot of talk nowadays about, well, the old church is belly up, and let's just get the house churches going again. It doesn't work like that. I think there's always perhaps fewer churches. I think the parish church may be belly up, and that the movement towards greater and more powerfully diverse and impassioned centers, kind of cathedrals in the old way, of vortexes of human energy, and then a lot of mesoteric groups spinning out, would be the model that I see as viable. But I certainly would never recommend going back and starting with the Jesus Church again, because there's no such thing, at least in our own culture.
I think one of the things you're saying is my experience too. It's helpful that a pastor, for instance, or a priest in a congregation, you've got these different levels. You've got these different kind of people. And one person, when I was asking in a group, I said, "What's a metaphor that kind of gets the way you see yourself, your work?" And one person said, and I've heard it said in other ways since, he said, "I feel like a hospice chaplain and a midwife." And by hospice chaplain, it didn't mean the kind of typical pastoral care of people who are dying or who have died, but that for people it's not working. The programs or the ideas aren't working, and to me, the tremendous hard work of helping people grieve, let go, claim what's good in that tradition, that's hard work. And then there are others in that congregation are hungry, ready to move on to new practices, and so they're wanting new forms. So my question is, what does it take to stand in the crucible of that? Because you don't get accolades for either one, really. And so what helps a person stay in those forces without getting attached to any of them, looking for that third way, looking for what's trying to be birthed? And it seems to me it's a requires a radical commitment to self-discipline to be so grounded in the heart that you can live in that and look and be able to see the patterns. And my experience, most clergy just say, I don't have time for that kind of hard work. I don't have time to make that commitment to that inner life. And I'm saying, I don't think it's negotiable.
Yeah.
You know, it's just to survive in that, and not just survive, but to thrive in that role takes enormous grounding as a priority. And I get frustrated because I think a lot of people want to add on something. And I say, no, you know, it's so much more profound than that.
No, we have to, I think we just have to be so charitable in how we deal with one another. I'm thinking on an institutional level. I mean, I think that, and we have to believe in a theology of abundance, and we have to have our own history. So what does it mean to have these Jewish followers of this Jesus accept these Gentile followers of Jesus and say, we're going to learn to live alongside one another. We're going to have dual realities. That's always been our history. So we've got to find a way to reclaim that, and the only way that I know to do that is when we get centered on the radical grace we felt in our own life. So I think, again, that's why it's so ironic that I'm a bishop, because I think the bureaucratic solutions are so long-term, they're not going to be immediately helpful at all. They're almost irrelevant.
Yeah.
What really matters is finding containers, and in my position, giving allowances for people to experiment, to find new ways to discover the holy. Yeah. And for the established, quote, established churches to be undefensive about that. Mm-hmm. If these people flourish, God bless them. Yeah. You know? Our job is to find out how we can flourish.
We can't waste our time fighting the thing that we perceive as a problem. We should spend our time doing the new thing, you know, and trust that the life that this has, it's going to play itself out as it needs to. But if we spend all our time trying to deconstruct the old structure, then we'll have put no energy into building the new thing. And so I find myself that, you know, I've moved myself in a way in my ministry out away from the center of the institution. I live with a small Episcopal monastic community. I serve a very small parish on Sundays, and I'm really on the edge, the fringes of the institution. And I love the institution. I think without those big, beautiful Sunday services and the liturgy and the incense and the music and the grand choir, all of that led me into the church. And I was so deeply fed by it for so long, but at some point, I wanted something more that it wasn't giving. And it wasn't that it was bad or that it was wrong. I just wanted to go further, and I wanted something different. And it seemed like the church had kind of installed the ceiling at the exoteric, as Cynthia said. Mm-hmm. And other traditions never installed that ceiling. And they had their exoteric, and when they saw someone getting to this other point, they would guide them on into that next phase. And we became afraid of that next phase, and we just put a ceiling in, and those people are left floundering. So anyway, I honor the institution, but I find that often the fresh life, it emerges from the fringes, from the edges, and so that's where I've kind of moved myself so that I can feel into what's trying to grow.
And God hope you could stay there, because there's a temptation, and I see it rife in some of these alternative forms that are growing up in this highly experimental age, to rely on massive self-importance. You know, huge websites, huge inflated hype about instant enlightenment, and to be able to stay in the little. I mean, I'm thinking, and I'm reflecting, Porter, when you talked about trying to create a welcoming space, I've lived with my little wisdom schools in the cracks of that welcoming space. Right. That certainly the Diocese of Western North Carolina has become a home for our wisdom work and a real center of it through your gracious invitation. And my bishop in Colorado, Rob O'Neill, is very much of that same ilk. They're trying to sow seeds for the future at the same time as holding the present in a container. So it's that invitation that allows me not to get oppositional.
Right.
That can say, I don't have to thumb my nose at the church and waste my time saying how bad it is. That gracious people with vision and insight have given a space for the new seeds to be tended.
And people flock.
And they flock. And I see that what will happen is that will dump back in. That one of the things you begin to learn when you're working in wisdom work is it's not quantitative and it's not linear. When Rupert Sheldrake was talking about morphogenic fields, the whole idea that one action at the right place can have manifold effects. I was thinking, Mahan, talking about eldering, that when I first encountered that first church in Philadelphia, my priest there was a third order Episcopal Franciscan. He introduced me just in his presence and his being to that stream, and he witnessed to its integrity by doing nonviolent action in Philadelphia during the 60s. We rescued him out of prison more than one time. So I saw the model, and that's all it took to get me started. And I think that the people that we grow up, if we raise them right in wisdom school, we can disarm the negative programming. That I hear a lot of people say, oh, if I'd known Christianity was like this, And when that disarming is done, and I can say, well, there's bishops and there's dioceses that are living a new vision, it begins to plug them back in. And then they raise the whole mix within the parish congregation so that the ceiling gets raised.
Yeah.
So that's the model I'm kind of hoping on and betting on.
And someone was asking me why I was coming here, and I came up with all kinds of reasons. But honestly, I hope this isn't the wrong thing to say to you. I think, Cynthia, your example of what it means to lead a holy life. And that's contagious. And I think that's a lot of what we do, is that it's not so much the program, it's not so much the package, it's not so much the institution, it's, are you leading a holy life? And do you believe it has the power to have those ripple effects?
Yeah. And of course it's funny because when you said this, I first winced and then I stopped wincing. Because my own teacher, Rafe, the fellow who most changed my own life, said, of course we should all aspire to sainthood. That simply is the normal progression of a human life. That's what we're here for. But we have them cooped up in these behavioral aspects. And my immediate dismissive thing is to say, who, me, live a holy life? Ha, 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 I eat meat. I won't tell you half of it, but when you realize that holy doesn't have to do with external behavior norms, but with a real kind of effort to live with passion and integrity.
That's right.
And I don't think I'm better at it than anybody else, but I think I'm committed to it. And after a while, just as you hold the post, I'm a semi-elder at this point. And whatever you do, that becomes what you give and what you plow back.
Yeah.
And so that's the post that I realize I have to hold. I sometimes feel still like I'm the cabin boy trying to steer the schooner. But whatever we can do to repair the gaps in the transmission link so that there's something that we can hand back, and that Matthew's generation doesn't have to say, well, we have to completely invent the wheel from the the ground up.
Right.
And that's my hope.
Yeah. And that trajectory, though, I think is something we've lost in our culture. It goes, again, back to the eldering topic, that we've lost a sense of trajectory for the human life. that there is such a thing as the ripened human fruit, or the completed human being, or the saint, and that's what we're to grow into. In our culture, you retire and then you go play golf and you get plastic surgery to make yourself look younger than you are. There's no sense that you're ripening into a saint. And that then your job is to transmit that to the next generation.
Exactly.
And I think some of the transmission is not just content or wisdom, it's the power of blessing, it's naming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Porter and I were talking yesterday about, as bishop, his role. He has enormous power to name where new life's happening and to bless it. I mean, a lot of people may not know, but I think some of it is just, yes. Thank you for your courage. You took a great risk there. For our elders to see that and offer that could make a huge difference in people saying, okay, I'm not so alone.
And to not be afraid to name it in other traditions.
Right. Absolutely. Say a word more about that. Not to name, be afraid to name.
Well, I think that the good news is the world's gotten so much smaller. The bad news is that often that's made us more anxious. But if we can get over our anxiety, what an opportunity to learn the gifts that we have from other religious traditions and to find a common meeting place at that deep level.
And I think this is one of the delicate dances we have to enter into with the religions right now as we discern how to give that blessing, the transmission that our lineages hold. How do we not let that be lost while also not trying to fit the next generation to force them into our container, which it's really in many ways this sort of wonky evolutionary moment that we live in where a new awareness is emerging, largely because of globalization. As you said, we are interwoven as a single planet and a single human family in a way we never have been before. And so we began to see, if we're one family, then all of our religions are our shared, our collective spiritual inheritance, our collective spiritual resources as one family, and we can't fragment our wisdoms in the way we used to. And so people who are being born into this new consciousness of interconnection at a global level, the old religious forms simply don't fit their emerging awareness. They don't want to take on a limited identity.
That's the pot.
Right.
That you talked about.
At the same time, those traditions hold the practices that are needed for transformation to mature them. And so the risk of them not identifying with the tradition is that they don't receive the great blessings of the traditions. So it's this dance of, in one respect, today we are the parents of our religions as we help guide them into this global era. And at the same time, we're the parents in that we're helping them sort of shuck off their superiority complexes, their limiting views, but they're still our parents in that they hold the practices that will mature and transform our human being. So it's this dance of, they're parenting us and we're parenting them. And this dance of people outside the traditions who need the blessings to be given freely so that they're not lost. But so often we want to hold those blessings within the institutional framework because the institution has an ego, and to realize that it's not the structure that's so important, it's the transmission that's important. So how do you get that to flow out freely? And as Cynthia said, you still have to have a form, though. You can't transmit without a form. So I don't know that I have any answers to any of that, but that's this very fascinating dance that we're all being invited to.
But the blessing for sure is not, I bless you for doing it like me.
Right.
I bless you for not doing it, or not being bound by the form I've used, but the spirit, the dynamism is what you bless, knowing it's going to be different, and knowing that it's mutual. I like what you said there, because I can feel with my grandchildren. I'm sitting at their feet, learning, a lot, and so it is interesting. It's not it is, there's a mutuality in
Right.
in the eldering. Who's eldering who?
Reciprocity.
Yeah.
Yeah, that learning. We're breaking out of the old hierarchical models where it's just simply a transmission one way,
Yeah.
and then it's going both ways. And I don't think I finished the sentence I started off when I was saying that whole thing, was that this moment, the old forms don't fit the new awareness, and the new forms don't yet exist.
Mhm.
And so we have a lot of people caught in the middle in this moment who don't have a form here that fits, and the old form doesn't work. And so our work is to really courageously and skillfully and carefully evolve new forms.
Is that where the law of the three? Can you talk about that in terms of the law of the three?
Well, I can't, but maybe
Yeah.
Cynthia can. Porter was going to
Yeah.
jump into it.
I don't know, but I would just want to say that I'm real clear in my own role. That I think you've named it very, very well, and I think that we're at a kind of quantum point with your generation, that we've really stepped over into a new world in a way that I'll never step over into. It's not because I lack the freedom or the mental agility or the heart agility, but because I'm in a different place in my journey.
Right.
And I understand that my role at this point is to distinguish content from form for people just clearly enough so that I can help them to understand what is the essence of the lineage flowing through Christianity and separate it. For many of them, it's just so inextricably intertwined with structures that don't work that they want to throw out the structures too. They think we got to get rid of the whole thing.
Right.
But if you could show them and let them taste what the form is, and then say, God love you.
That's right.
This is the gift.
Right.
Blessings on you. This is what we can pass on, but we're not passing on a church building. We're not passing on languages. We're not passing on anything, no matter how
Bishops
beautiful.
are still in.
Yeah. Well, I know, but you know, you're holding your form too, because like what has been said already. I think Matthew said it. Or when you can actually hold a post, and the bishop post has power.
Yes.
Right.
And to bring your power to say, we do this, and to applaud that. I've noticed even teaching centering prayer, that when the rector in the parish joins the group and does it,
That's right.
life begins to transform. When the rector's too busy and, they remain in the basement for 7 years. So there is a post involved in directing attention and shaping forms and giving permission. And while your hands are tied in certain ways, you make sure. It's like water has to run into the next larger channel before it reaches the sea.
Right.
And you tend that channel.
Yeah. I had an image, and then I wanted to say one other thing. And the image, as you were talking, Matthew, is I kept thinking maybe a helpful image for us is to think of the resurrected Christ as walking through walls.
Yes.
So we're not going to demolish all the walls, but we're just going to acknowledge Jesus can walk through them. So he can be in this room, and that room, and that room. You know? And the other thing I want to say is it just reminds me of how I started. When I left the church, the way I came back to the church was I volunteered at a homeless shelter in an Episcopal church on Thursday nights, and they had a Friday morning Eucharist at 6 o'clock in the morning. And so I'd stay up all night with the guests, and then we'd all go to church, and then we'd have breakfast, and they'd go on their way. And I absolutely hated the sermon. Sometimes I literally put my hands over my ears. I couldn't say the creed. I gave thanks to Jesus that there was no coffee hour, there were no ushers. But every time I ate the bread and drank the wine, I wept. And it took me 3 months before I could introduce myself to anyone. And it's useful for me to remember that the things we have at the center always have that power.
Yeah.
And what we have to do is help lead people back to there. And then Jesus will do his work.
I think that, speaks to where we find our unity. And do we find it in texts and creeds and rational concepts and cognitive processes, or do we find it in something that's much deeper, much more intuitive? Do we find it in things like bread and wine and people gathered around a table? And those ways of knowing are essentially heart ways of knowing. It's much more right brain ways of knowing. And I think for so long we've tried to force our unity into left-brained ways of knowing. And that's not where the deepest unity is really felt and known.
Well, we've been an institution instead of a movement, and we've got to get back to being a movement.
I think another point of unity is integrity on both sides.
Yeah, and
People
as Matthew said, authenticity, that what makes this sustainable, this container sustainable, and it's that authenticity.
Yeah.
As you said, it's not like what the outer trappings look like, but the sincerity of our heart and our journey. And this just fills me with so much hope that the four of you can sit in this room, the new priest, the bishop, the feminine priest, and the elder, and to have this kind of a heartfelt conversation. And I hope this is only the first of many to come, and because of technology and that the world has gotten smaller, we can have more of this very same kind of conversation.
Well, thank you for making this happen.
And I hope you're saying yes to the invitation to more.
Yes,
Thanks
for hosting us, Robin.
Robin. What
It's
a
a
pleasure
gift
to
to be a part of this. Thank you so much.